For most people, martial law is something that happens somewhere else, in another country, during another century, announced loudly with sirens, speeches, and emergency broadcasts. But history shows that power rarely arrives with noise. More often, it arrives quietly, wrapped in procedure, legality, and routine. Imagine waking up in the state of Georgia on an ordinary morning. Your phone shows no emergency alert, the news channels look normal, yet something feels wrong. Traffic moves slower than usual, police presence seems heavier, a helicopter circles longer than it should. Nothing has been announced, but the atmosphere has changed, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Georgia is not a random place for such a scenario. It is a logistical artery of the United States, home to major military installations, international ports, data infrastructure, and one of the busiest airports on Earth. In moments of crisis, states like Georgia become operational centers, not just regions on a map. Under American law, governors already possess broad emergency powers. These powers do not require dramatic declarations to begin taking effect. They activate through executive orders, mutual aid agreements, and coordination between state agencies. Martial law as a phrase may never be spoken, yet the conditions that define it can quietly assemble piece by piece. The first signs would not look dramatic. There would be no tanks rolling through suburban streets. Instead, there would be efficiency, curfews framed as public safety measures, National Guard units deployed to assist local police, courts temporarily suspended due to logistical strain, checkpoints justified by infrastructure protection. Each action would be legal in isolation, temporary by definition, reasonable on paper. The danger is not in one decision, but in how quickly many small decisions can converge into a new reality. History offers uncomfortable parallels. During wars, natural disasters, and periods of unrest, democratic governments have repeatedly suspended normal processes in the name of stability. Habeas corpus has been paused before. Military jurisdiction over civilians has occurred before. The lesson is not that such measures are always malicious, but that once activated, emergency authority rarely retreats on its own timeline. It waits for permission to end, and that permission does not always come quickly. In Georgia, the transition would likely happen through silence rather than force. Information would slow before movement ever did. Official statements would become vague. Press briefings would be delayed. Social media would fill the gap with confusion, rumor, and denial. People would argue about whether anything unusual was happening at all. That argument alone would be enough to prevent collective resistance, because uncertainty is the most powerful control mechanism of all. Daily life would continue, but in a narrower corridor. Travel would feel restricted without being banned. Permits would be required where they weren't before. Law enforcement would operate under expanded authority, not because officers had changed, but because the rules governing them had. The line between civilian and military responsibility would blur, especially in areas labeled critical to national security. Most people would comply, not out of fear, but out of habit. Normalcy bias would do the rest. What makes unannounced martial law uniquely dangerous is that it avoids the psychological trigger that normally alerts people to defend their rights. There is no single moment to point to and say, "This is when it happened." By the time the realization spreads, the mechanisms of control are already normalized. Courts are slow, media is cautious, citizens are divided, and the system, now operating under emergency logic, prioritizes order over explanation. This is not a prediction, and it is not an accusation. It is a thought experiment grounded in real legal frameworks and historical precedent. The question is not whether Georgia or any state would impose martial law without warning. The real question is whether the public would recognize it if it did, because power does not need to announce itself when it can simply continue, uninterrupted, while everyone debates whether anything has changed at all. By the time martial law is officially declared, if it ever is, the most important shift has already occurred. The silence has done its work, and history shows that when silence becomes policy, the return to normal is never guaranteed. And this is where the scenario grows darker, not because of sudden violence, but because of how easily people adapt. Human societies are remarkably good at adjusting to reduced freedoms when those reductions arrive gradually. In Georgia, days would pass, then weeks, with small changes stacking quietly on top of one another. Government buildings would operate on limited access. Certain records would become temporarily unavailable. Public gatherings would require permits justified by safety concerns. None of this would be framed as martial law, it would be framed as responsibility. The legal structure would remain intact on the surface. Courts would still exist, but hearings would be postponed. Judges would defer to executive authority during exceptional circumstances. Lawyers would argue process, not principles. The law would still be present, but it would move slowly, while enforcement moved quickly. This imbalance alone would reshape behavior. When people sense that appealing decisions takes longer than complying with them, compliance becomes the default choice. Media coverage would not disappear, it would narrow. Language would change subtly. Words like order, coordination, and stability would replace words like rights and limits. Journalists would rely more heavily on official briefings because access elsewhere would be restricted. Independent verification would become difficult, not because it was forbidden, but because it was impractical. And when information becomes difficult to obtain, most people stop trying. In neighborhoods, the changes would be discussed in whispers. Someone would mention that a friend was questioned at a checkpoint longer than expected. Someone else would say, it's probably nothing. Another would insist this is how things were always done during emergencies. Disagreement would fracture attention, and fractured attention prevents unified response. History shows that control does not require consensus, it only requires confusion. Georgia's infrastructure would make this environment especially resilient to scrutiny. Major highways, ports, and communication hubs would be classified as protected assets. Military presence around them would feel justified, even reassuring to some. After all, protection implies danger, and danger justifies authority. The more critical the infrastructure, the easier it becomes to defend extraordinary measures around it. What would be missing is a clear endpoint. Emergency powers are designed to be temporary, but temporary is not a date, it is a condition. As long as the condition can be argued to exist, the powers remain. A vague threat is more useful than a specific one because it can never be fully resolved. Stability becomes the goal, not restoration. Order becomes the metric, not freedom. At this stage, resistance would not look heroic, it would look inconvenient. Those who question the situation would be labeled disruptive, irresponsible, or dangerously naive. Not arrested in mass, but marginalized. Their concerns would be framed as distractions during a sensitive period. And many citizens, exhausted by uncertainty, would accept that framing willingly. The most unsettling aspect of unannounced martial law is that it does not require bad intentions. It can emerge from caution, from fear of escalation, from the desire to prevent chaos at all costs. But intentions do not determine outcomes. Systems do. Once authority centralizes, it resists decentralization. Once surveillance expands, it rarely contracts fully. Once people adjust to being monitored, monitored becomes normal. Months later, if asked when things changed, no one would agree. There would be no shared memory of a single moment, just a gradual realization that the rules are different now and no one remembers voting on them. The absence of an announcement would have done its job perfectly. It would have removed the opportunity for collective awareness. This is why the idea matters, not because it is likely, but because it is possible. Democracies do not collapse only through coups and declarations. Sometimes they erode through continuity, through laws that never quite return to their original shape. Georgia, in this scenario, is not a villain, it is a mirror, reflecting how modern power operates when efficiency becomes more valuable than consent. And the final question lingers long after the emergency fades, if it ever does. If control can be established without being named and accepted without being challenged, then what exactly are citizens waiting for before they decide something has gone too far? Because by the time martial law is officially acknowledged, the real shift may already be history, quietly written during the days when nothing seemed to happen at all. Over time, the psychological landscape would change even more than the legal one. People would stop asking whether the situation was temporary and start planning their lives around it. Businesses would adjust operating hours to align with new restrictions. Schools would modify schedules, citing security coordination. Churches, community centers, and local gatherings would quietly thin out, not because they were banned, but because people sensed that visibility now carried risk. When uncertainty becomes permanent, caution replaces freedom without ever being ordered to. Children growing up during this period would accept the environment as normal. Seeing armed personnel near government buildings would not feel alarming to them, it would feel routine. This is how extraordinary authority embeds itself into culture, not through fear alone, but through familiarity. Adults might remember a different time, but memory weakens when daily survival demands adaptation. Over time, nostalgia loses its power to motivate action. Behind the scenes, decision-making would become increasingly centralized. Emergency committees would meet behind closed doors, justified by the need for speed and confidentiality. Oversight bodies would still exist, but their influence would be limited by delayed access to information. Transparency would be promised repeatedly, always scheduled for later. Later would never quite arrive. And because no single law declared this arrangement permanent, undoing it would require effort no one felt empowered to initiate. Technology would quietly reinforce the system. Increased monitoring of transportation, communication networks, and digital transactions would be introduced as safeguards against instability. Each system would be described as temporary, automated, neutral, but technology does not forget. Once infrastructure for control exists, removing it feels wasteful, even dangerous. The tools built for emergencies would remain available long after the emergency itself faded into abstraction. Public trust would fracture unevenly. Some citizens would feel safer than ever, convinced that order had prevented chaos. Others would feel a constant, undefined pressure, sensing that something essential had been traded away but unable to articulate exactly when or how. This division would be self-sustaining. As long as people disagreed on whether anything was wrong, the system would face no unified challenge. At no point would there need to be mass arrests or open violence. In fact, the absence of visible brutality would be used as evidence that nothing extreme was happening. If this were martial law, people would say, we would know. That belief would become the final barrier to recognition. Martial law in this form would not look like history books described it. It would look administrative, boring, procedural. That is precisely why it would work. Eventually, the original justification would be forgotten. The threat that triggered the emergency powers would blur, then vanish from public conversation. But the mechanisms would remain, justified now by precedent rather than necessity. This is how temporary measures become inherited structures, not through intent, but through inertia. The system would continue simply because stopping it would require admitting that it should never have gone this far. If questioned years later, officials might genuinely struggle to explain how authority had expanded so much. Each step would have made sense at the time. Each decision would have been reasonable in isolation. There would be no villain to point to, no dramatic turning point to reverse, only a trail of paperwork, executive orders, and deferred accountability. And this is where the scenario becomes less about Georgia and more about modern societies everywhere.
The question is not whether people would resist an obvious takeover. Most would. The question is whether people recognize control when it arrives disguised as continuity. When daily life continues, when stores remain open, when no announcement interrupts the routine, the human instinct is to assume that the system is still functioning as intended. In the end, the most powerful force maintaining unannounced martial law would not be soldiers or laws, but disbelief, the belief that something so significant could not happen quietly. That belief has been wrong before. History is filled with moments where people later asked how everything changed without anyone stopping it. The answer is almost always the same. It didn't feel like a moment. It felt like a gradual adjustment, one that never seemed urgent enough to confront. And that is the final unease this scenario leaves behind. If freedom can be narrowed without being declared, if authority can expand without being named, then vigilance is not a reaction to crisis. It is a continuous responsibility. Because when silence replaces warning, the absence of alarms is not reassurance. It is the signal most people never learn to listen for.